The gavel felt like a distant earthquake, a tremor that ran through the polished floorboards of the courtroom, up the legs of the defense table, and into the trembling hands of Arthur Pendleton. He watched not the judge, whose face was a mask of stern indifference, but the small girl beside him. Lily, her world, already shrouded in a permanent, unyielding darkness, was now collapsing inward with the terrifying sounds of injustice. Tears traced clean paths down her dusty cheeks, silent waterfalls of despair. She wasn't wailing. It was a quieter, more profound grief, the sound of a heart breaking in a place that was supposed to mend such things. Her small fingers were tangled in the coarse fabric of his worn tweed jacket, her only anchor in a swirling vortex of adult words she couldn't fully comprehend but whose cruel meaning she felt with every fiber of her being. They were going to take Shadow. The thought was a physical blow, knocking the air from Arthur's lungs. Shadow, her guide, her guardian, her furry, four-legged soulmate. The judge cleared his throat, the sound scraping against the raw nerves of the silent room. Having heard the testimony, he began, his voice devoid of the compassion Arthur had desperately prayed for. And in light of the evidence presented by Mr. Gable, this court finds the animal known as Shadow to be a danger to this community. Every word was a nail being hammered into a coffin. Lily's coffin of loneliness, Arthur's coffin of failure. He had failed her. Again. He, the man who had run from the world of law to escape this very feeling, had been dragged back in only to prove his own incompetence once more. The plaintiff, Mr. Gable, sat opposite them, a portrait of smug satisfaction. His expensive suit was uncreased, his silver hair perfectly coiffed. He met Arthur's gaze with a flicker of triumphant malice, a look that said, "You see? Money and influence always win." He had painted Shadow as a vicious, uncontrollable beast, and in a courtroom that valued slick presentation over messy truth, his lies had found fertile ground. Lily's quiet sobs grew a little louder, a heartbreaking counterpoint to the judge's clinical pronouncements. She didn't understand phrases like municipal ordinance or euthanasia order, but she understood the finality in the man's tone. She understood that the warm, steady presence she relied on to navigate her sightless world was being ripped away. The thought of her waking up tomorrow and reaching for the dog that would not be there was a vision of pure agony for Arthur. This little girl, who had already lost her parents and her sight in a cruel twist of fate, was about to lose the one being that made her feel safe. The injustice was so monumental, so fundamentally wrong, that it felt like the very walls of the courtroom should crack and crumble. We can't let this happen. If you believe that the bond between a girl and her dog is worth fighting for, that truth must prevail over lies, then leave a like and share your thoughts on what should happen next. Your support can change the course of a story. Don't let their light go out. Arthur hadn't always been this broken man in a frayed jacket, a refugee from the life he'd once commanded. There was a time when the courtroom was his kingdom, and he its undisputed king. Arthur Pendleton, Esquire. The name had once been a harbinger of dread for opposing counsel and a beacon of hope for wealthy, often morally ambiguous, clients. He had been a lion of litigation, prowling the polished floors of corporate law firms in handcrafted Italian leather shoes. His suits were bespoke. His watch was a quiet statement of immense value, and his mind was a steel trap, spring-loaded with precedents and loopholes. He didn't argue cases. He dismantled them, piece by painstaking piece, until his opponent's position was nothing but a pile of rubble. He'd reveled in the intellectual combat, the thrill of the win, the sheer, intoxicating power of bending the law to his will. His specialty was making problems disappear for people who could afford the magic trick. He lived in a penthouse that scraped the sky, a sterile sanctuary of glass and steel that overlooked a city he felt he owned. But the higher he climbed, the more the air thinned, and the harder it became to breathe. He had convinced himself that the law was a game, a complex intellectual exercise where morality was a handicap. It was about winning, full stop. But a game implies no real-world consequences, and the consequences of Arthur's victories were very real, etching themselves into his soul like acid. The case that finally shattered the illusion was for a pharmaceutical giant. They had produced a miracle drug, and he was tasked with defending it against a class action lawsuit. Hundreds of plaintiffs, ordinary people, claimed the drug had caused debilitating, lifelong side effects. Arthur's job was to prove it didn't. He worked tirelessly, brilliantly. He buried the opposing side in paperwork, discredited their expert witnesses with surgical precision, and created a narrative of mass hysteria and opportunistic greed. He painted the victims as villains. He won. The victory was hailed as a masterpiece of legal defense. He received a bonus that could have purchased a small island. He remembered standing in his penthouse, champagne flute in hand, looking out at the glittering city lights, and feeling nothing but a profound, cavernous emptiness. The faces of the plaintiffs haunted him. A young mother in a wheelchair, an old man who could no longer hold his grandchild, their eyes filled with a bewildered betrayal. He had won the game, but he had lost something elemental within himself. The final crack came a few weeks later, when an internal memo was leaked, a memo he had successfully argued to have sealed, deemed inadmissible. It was the smoking gun, dated a year before the drug's release, detailing the company's full knowledge of the devastating potential side effects. They knew, and he, in his blind ambition, had been their willing instrument of deceit. He hadn't just defended a company. He had actively participated in the destruction of lives. The weight of it was crushing, a physical pressure in his chest. The man in the mirror was a stranger, his eyes holding the same hollowed-out look he'd seen in the people he had destroyed. He couldn't breathe the city air anymore. It felt thick with his own lies. So he ran. He liquidated his assets, severed all ties, and vanished from the world that had made him and then unmade him. He bought a small, forgotten cabin deep in the woods, miles from the nearest town. He traded his suits for flannel shirts, his penthouse for a porch with a view of pine trees instead of skyscrapers. He sought silence, penance, and anonymity. He wanted to forget the man he had been. For years, the silence was his only companion. He read old books, chopped his own wood, and listened to the wind in the trees, trying to scrub the stain of his past from his soul. The solitude was both a punishment and a balm. He was a hermit, a ghost, the wounded healer with no one left to heal but himself, and he was failing miserably at even that. His guilt was a constant, low-grade fever, a shadow that followed him even on the sunniest days. He believed this was his life now, a quiet, lonely path to the grave. He had no right to expect more. He had done too much damage, participated in too much pain. Then, one rain-lashed autumn afternoon, the silence was broken. A sound, faint at first, then more insistent, the whimpering of a child and the frightened barking of a dog. He had found them huddled under a thicket of ferns not half a mile from his cabin. A little girl, no older than 9, with eyes that stared but didn't see, and a young German shepherd, ribs showing, protectively curled around her, growling at Arthur's approach but refusing to leave her side. This was Lily and this was Shadow. The story came out in pieces from a kindly social worker named Mrs. Gable, no relation, he would later learn with bitter irony, to his future nemesis, who was searching for them. Lily was a recent orphan, her parents lost in the same car accident that had stolen her sight. She had been placed in a temporary foster home, a chaotic and neglectful environment from which she had fled, with her only friend, a stray dog she had named Shadow, who had attached himself to her with a fierce, inexplicable loyalty. The system was overwhelmed, and Lily was slipping through the cracks. Looking at the terrified, brave little girl and the equally terrified, loyal dog, something in Arthur's frozen heart began to thaw. He saw in them a purity and vulnerability that stood in stark contrast to the calculated cruelty of the world he had left behind. He couldn't fix his past, he couldn't undo the harm he had done, but maybe, just maybe, he could do one small good thing. He used a fraction of his old life's money and a sliver of his dormant legal knowledge to navigate the labyrinthine bureaucracy of social services. He fought, not with cunning and deceit, but with a raw, unyielding determination he hadn't felt in years. He argued for them. He argued for himself. He became Lily's legal guardian. The cabin, once a place of penance, slowly transformed into a home. The silence was filled with Lily's hesitant laughter and Shadow's contented sighs. Arthur taught Lily how to read Braille, his rough fingers tracing the raised dots alongside hers. Lily, in turn, taught Arthur how to live again. She didn't see the disgraced lawyer or the haunted recluse. She only saw the kind man who made her oatmeal in the morning and read her stories by the fire at night. And Shadow was the bridge between them. The dog was more than a pet. He was an extension of Lily herself. His every sense was attuned to her. He guided her through the woods, his body a steady, warm presence against her leg. He would nudge her hand when she dropped something, alert her to obstacles with a low whine, and sleep with his head on her pillow, his rhythmic breathing a comfort in her dark world. Arthur watched their bond with a sense of awe. It was a love so pure, so untainted by the complexities that governed human relationships, that it felt sacred. He found himself talking to the dog, confiding in him the fears and regrets he couldn't voice to anyone else. Shadow would listen, his head cocked, his amber eyes seeming to hold a deep, ancient wisdom. The three of them formed an unlikely family, a small island of solace against the tide of their collective pasts. Arthur began to believe he could be redeemed, not by grand gestures, but by the quiet, daily acts of caring for these two souls entrusted to him. The peace was fragile, he knew, but for a time it was enough. It was everything. It was a life he would protect with every last ounce of his being. And now, in a courtroom that smelled of old paper and new despair, that life was being threatened by a man who represented everything Arthur had once been and now despised. This wasn't just about a dog anymore. It was about his redemption. It was about Lily's future. It was a fight he would not lose. The arrival of the legal notice had been as jarring as a gunshot in the quiet woods. It was delivered by a courier, a crisp, white envelope that felt alien and hostile in Arthur's calloused hand. The language within was cold, formal, and brutal. It was a summons, a complaint filed by his nearest neighbor, a man named Alistair Gable, who lived in a sprawling modern mansion a mile down the road, a stark architectural intrusion into the rustic landscape. Arthur had only encountered Gable a few times on the winding country road. He was a man who radiated an aura of impatient wealth, driving his luxury SUV too fast, his face a permanent mask of disdain for his rustic surroundings. The complaint was a work of malicious fiction. It accused Shadow of being a chronically aggressive and dangerous animal. It cited an incident a week prior, claiming Shadow had trespassed onto Gable's property, viciously attacked his prized, pedigreed Persian cat, and displayed unprovoked savagery toward Gable himself when he intervened. The cat, the complaint alleged, had been so traumatized it required extensive veterinary care, and Gable was seeking not only damages but a court order for the dog to be removed and destroyed as a public menace. Arthur had read the words, and the world tilted on its axis. He remembered the day of the alleged attack perfectly. It had been a warm, sunny afternoon. He, Lily, and Shadow had spent the entire day together, deep in their own patch of woods, far from Gable's property. They had been working on a new Braille book, Lily's fingers flying over the pages while Shadow dozed at her feet, his tail thumping a gentle rhythm against the mossy ground. The dog hadn't left their side for a moment. It was a lie, a complete, unadulterated fabrication. But why? He walked over to Gable's property that evening, the legal papers clutched in his hand, intending to reason with the man. He found Gable on his manicured lawn, overseeing a landscaping crew. "Mr. Gable," Arthur began, his voice steady, "there has been a terrible mistake. My dog was with me and my daughter all day last Tuesday. He couldn't possibly have done what you're claiming." Gable didn't even turn to look at him. He merely gestured dismissively toward the house. "My security cameras tell a different story," he said, his voice dripping with condescension. "And my vet bills are very real. I'd advise you to get a lawyer, though I doubt it will do you much good. People around here don't take kindly to dangerous animals." The mention of security cameras sent a spike of cold dread through Arthur. Could he be wrong? Could Shadow have somehow slipped away? No. He trusted the dog implicitly, trusted his bond with Lily. But Gable's confidence was unnerving. He was a man accustomed to getting his way, a man who saw the world as something to be molded to his desires. The days that followed were a slow descent into a nightmare Arthur thought he had escaped. He tried to do what Gable suggested, to find a lawyer. He made calls to his old world, reaching out to former colleagues, men and women with whom he had once shared courtroom victories and expensive dinners. The response was a unanimous cold shoulder. His name, Arthur Pendleton, was poison. He was the brilliant lawyer who had committed career suicide, the ghost who had walked away from it all. They treated him with a mixture of pity and contempt. "You can't come back from a thing like that, Arthur," one former partner told him, his voice smooth and final. "You're a pariah." The local lawyers were no better. They were small-town practitioners, intimidated by Gable's wealth and influence. He was a major landowner, a significant economic force in the small community. To cross him was to risk their livelihood. They'd listen politely to Arthur's story, their eyes filled with a kind of weary sympathy, and then they would regretfully inform him of a conflict of interest or a caseload that was simply too full. He was alone. The full, crushing weight of his isolation settled upon him. In the city, he had been feared and respected. Here, he was nobody, a recluse with a troubled past and no credibility. Gable, meanwhile, was methodically turning the community against them. He spoke to neighbors, posted on the town's social media page, and spun a tale of a terrified pet owner protecting his family from a vicious stray kept by an irresponsible hermit. He was charming and persuasive, and his story, backed by his status, was easier to believe than the protestations of a man who actively shunned the world. People started to look at Arthur differently on his rare trips into town for supplies. They would pull their children closer when they saw him, their faces tight with suspicion. Whispers followed him down the aisles of the general store. The friendly nods he had grown accustomed to were replaced with hostile glares. The sanctuary he had built for himself and Lily was being besieged from the outside, its walls of peace and quiet crumbling under the assault of public opinion. The ticking clock grew louder with each passing day. The court date loomed, a black mark on the calendar. Lily could feel the change, even if she couldn't see it. Her world was measured in tones of voice, in the tension that radiated from Arthur's body. "Is Shadow in trouble, Papa Art?" she asked one evening, her voice small and laced with worry. She had started calling him that, a name that both warmed and broke his heart. He tried to shield her from the worst of it, to reassure her, but the tremor in his own voice betrayed his fear. "No, sweetie," he lied, hating the taste of the words. "Just a silly misunderstanding with a grumpy neighbor. We'll sort it out," but he didn't know if they would. The legal system he had once manipulated with such ease now seemed like an insurmountable beast. He was outgunned, outmaneuvered, and out of time. He would pore over the complaint at night by the light of a kerosene lamp, the formal legal language a cruel parody of his former life. He saw all the traps, all the ways Gable's high-priced lawyer would corner him, twist his words, and use his own past against him. He would be painted as an unstable recluse, his testimony unreliable. Lily's testimony would be dismissed as the emotional ramblings of a child. And Shadow, who could not speak for himself, would be condemned without a voice. The despair was a physical weight, pressing down on him, making it hard to breathe. He looked at Lily, sleeping peacefully with Shadow's head resting on her small chest, and felt a surge of desperate, primal protectiveness. He had run from a fight once before, and it had cost him his soul. He would not run from this one. Even if he had to stand alone in that courtroom, a broken man against a powerful enemy, he would fight. For Lily, for Shadow, for the last, fragile ember of his own redemption. He had to find a way. There had to be someone who would listen, someone who saw the truth not as a commodity to be bought and sold, but as something worth defending. His search was becoming more and more frantic, a race against the dwindling days on the calendar. Hope arrived not in a sleek corporate office, but in a place that smelled of antiseptic, animal fur, and a quiet, profound compassion. The local veterinary clinic was a small, unassuming building run by a woman named Dr. Anya Evans. She was in her late 60s, with kind eyes crinkled at the corners from a lifetime of smiling and a no-nonsense demeanor that Arthur found immediately grounding. He had taken Shadow to her for his initial checkup and vaccinations when he first became Lily's guardian, and she had been one of the few people in town who had treated him not as a strange hermit, but simply as a concerned pet owner. He went to her with the court documents, his last resort. He laid them out on her stainless steel examination table, the crisp papers looking starkly out of place next to a jar of dog treats. He explained the situation, his voice raw with a desperation he no longer tried to hide. He told her everything. Gable's accusation, the community's hostility, his own inability to find legal representation. He expected sympathy, perhaps a few words of encouragement. He received something far more valuable. Dr. Evans listened intently, her gaze never leaving his face. She read through the complaint, her lips pursed in concentration. When she finished, she looked not at him, but towards the waiting room where Lily was sitting with Shadow, the dog's head resting patiently in the little girl's lap. "I've known Alistair Gable for 20 years, she said, her voice low and steady. He brings his show cats here. He cares more about their pedigrees than their well-being. He's a man who believes his will is a force of nature." She tapped a finger on the document. "And I know German shepherds. I know Shadow. I examined him. His temperament is exemplary. He is gentle, intelligent, and fiercely protective, but not aggressive. The idea of him initiating a savage, unprovoked attack, it doesn't fit the animal I know." A flicker of hope, the first he had felt in weeks, ignited in Arthur's chest. "Can you testify to that? Would you be willing to be an expert witness?" Dr. Evans leaned back, her expression thoughtful. "I can and I will. But Alistair's lawyer will try to paint me as a small-town vet with a soft spot for strays. They will question my credentials and my objectivity. We need more than a character reference for a dog. We need to dismantle his story." "You said he claims to have security footage?" "Yes," Arthur said, the word tasting like defeat. "That's his ace in the hole. My word against a video." "Then we need to see that video," she stated simply. "His lawyer will have to produce it as evidence during discovery. We need to find what's on it, but more importantly, what's not on it. And we need to find someone who isn't afraid of Alistair Gable." She picked up a notepad and wrote down a name and a number. "Her name is Sarah Davies. She's young, just set up her own practice in the next county over. She's sharp as a tack and has a spine of steel. She used to be a public defender, so she's used to fighting for the underdog. Tell her Anya Evans sent you. And tell her it's a case about more than just a dog." The drive to Sarah Davies' office was filled with a cautious, fragile optimism. Her office wasn't a high-rise palace of law. It was a modest, second-floor walk-up above a bakery. The air smelled of fresh bread and coffee. Sarah herself was the antithesis of the lawyers Arthur had known. She was young, energetic, with bright, intelligent eyes and an attitude that was more firebrand than corporate stooge. She listened to Arthur's story, just as Dr. Evans had. But her questions were different. They were sharp, probing, tactical. "So Gable's entire case rests on his word and this alleged video?" she asked, tapping a pen against her legal pad. "He has the vet bills for his cat, too," Arthur added. "We'll subpoena those records," she said immediately. "And the vet's notes. We'll see exactly what kind of trauma this cat suffered. And we'll demand a copy of that security footage. If he refuses, we'll file a motion to compel. We're not going to let him hide the ball." For the first time, Arthur felt like he wasn't fighting alone. Sarah's confidence was infectious. She saw the injustice clearly and was angered by it. She wasn't intimidated by Gable's name or his money. If anything, it seemed to fuel her resolve. "Men like Gable," she said, her voice hard. "They think the world owes them. They think rules are for other people. I've seen it 100 times in my PD work. The powerful preying on the vulnerable because they can. Well, not on my watch." They spent the next 2 hours mapping out a strategy. Arthur's old legal mind began to wake from its long slumber, firing on cylinders he thought had rusted over. He and Sarah worked in tandem, a strange but effective partnership of her youthful fire and his seasoned, if wounded, experience. He knew the dirty tricks Gable's lawyers would play because he had written that playbook. He could anticipate their moves, their lines of questioning, their tactics for discrediting witnesses. "They'll bring up my past," Arthur said, the admission costing him. "They'll paint me as an unstable, disgraced lawyer who ran away to the woods. A man whose judgment can't be trusted." Sarah looked him straight in the eye. "Then we get ahead of it," she said without hesitation. "We own it. You're not that man anymore. You're a man who walked away from a corrupt system to find something real. You're a man who took in an orphaned, blind child and a rescue dog and gave them a home. Who do you think a jury will sympathize with more? The billionaire bully or the man who chose family over fortune?" It was a narrative Arthur had never considered. He had seen his past only as a source of shame, a liability. Sarah was reframing it as a strength, a testament to his character. The strategy sessions became a daily ritual in the week leading up to the trial. Sarah filed the motions, her legal acumen shining. They got the veterinary records for Gable's cat. As she suspected, the injuries were minor, a few scratches and a prescription for a mild sedative. "Hardly the mauling of a lifetime," she'd muttered, a grim smile on her face. The fight over the security footage was tougher. Gable's lawyers resisted, claiming it was private property, that they would present it in court and that was sufficient. But Sarah was relentless, and the judge grudgingly agreed, ordering them to provide a copy. When the digital file arrived, Arthur and Sarah watched it on her laptop, the tension in the small office thick enough to cut with a knife. The video was grainy, shot from a high angle. It showed Gable's pristine back lawn. Then, a blur of fur streaked across the frame. A German shepherd. It chased a smaller animal, the Persian cat. The dog was fast and the footage was shaky, but it was undeniably a dog that looked like Shadow. Arthur's heart sank. "It's him," he whispered. "How is that possible?" Sarah didn't answer. She just replayed the short clip. Again and again. She zoomed in, her brow furrowed in concentration. "Look," she said suddenly, pointing at the screen. "Look at the dog's left ear." Arthur leaned closer. In the blurry footage, it was difficult to see. But there was something. The dog in the video had a perfectly formed left ear. "Shadow's left ear has a small tear in the tip," Arthur said, his voice trembling with a new, dawning realization. "From when he was a stray. It's a tiny notch, but it's there." Dr. Evans noted it in his intake records. Sarah smiled, a slow, triumphant grin. "And look at this," she said, pausing the video on the clearest frame of the dog. She zoomed in on its collar. It was a plain, black nylon collar. "What kind of collar does Shadow wear?" "A brown leather one," Arthur said instantly. Lily braided a small blue string into it for him. It wasn't Shadow. It was another German shepherd. A dog that looked remarkably similar, but it wasn't him. "Gable didn't just lie," Sarah said, her eyes blazing. "He staged it. He found another dog to create his evidence. This isn't just a civil complaint anymore. This is fraud. This is perjury." The hope that had flickered was now a roaring fire. They had him. Gable, in his arrogance, had overplayed his hand. He had assumed no one would look closely enough, that no one would dare to challenge his version of reality. He had underestimated the broken-down lawyer, the fiery young public defender, and the unwavering love between a girl and her dog. The fight was far from over, but for the first time, Arthur Pendleton believed they could actually win. The day of the trial dawned gray and oppressive, the sky the color of slate. The courtroom felt even colder and more imposing than Arthur remembered from his preliminary hearing. It was a theater of judgment, and Alistair Gable was its lead actor and producer. He sat at the plaintiff's table with a team of 2 lawyers from a prestigious city firm. They exuded an air of expensive, unassailable confidence. Gable himself looked serene, occasionally whispering to his counsel with the easy familiarity of a man in control. On the other side sat Arthur, Lily, and Sarah Davies. They felt like a small, makeshift lifeboat next to Gable's battleship. Lily was dressed in her Sunday best, a simple blue dress Arthur had bought for her. She sat straight and still, her small hands clasped in her lap, her face a pale, unreadable mask. She couldn't see the sneer on Gable's face or the intimidating posture of his lawyers, but she could feel the tension coiling in the room. It was a palpable thing, a chill that had nothing to do with the building's ancient air conditioning. Shadow, of course, was not allowed in the courtroom. He was at home, being looked after by Dr. Evans, a fact that felt like a physical amputation to Lily. She kept reaching her hand down to her side, her fingers searching for the familiar, warm fur that was not there. Each time her hand found only empty air, a fresh wave of anxiety washed over her face. The proceedings began, and Gable's lawyer, a silver-haired man named Marcus Thorne, was as slick and venomous as Arthur had anticipated. He painted a masterful picture for the judge. He described Alistair Gable as a pillar of the community, a gentle animal lover, and a man simply trying to protect his home from a dangerous menace. He called Gable to the stand first. Gable's performance was flawless. He spoke in a calm, regretful tone, describing the horrifying incident. He detailed how he heard his beloved cat, Princess Fluffy, screaming in terror, how he rushed outside to see a large, snarling German shepherd, which he identified as Arthur's dog, Shadow, savagely tearing at his pet. He claimed the dog then turned on him, teeth bared, forcing him to retreat into his house and call for help. It was a compelling narrative, delivered with utter conviction. Thorne then played the security footage. On the large courtroom monitor, the grainy video flickered to life. The blur of the dog, the chase, the apparent attack. To the casual observer, it looked damning. Arthur could feel the judge's gaze harden, could feel the atmosphere in the room solidify against them. Thorne then called his second witness, the veterinarian who had treated Gable's cat. The vet, a man clearly intimidated by the proceedings and indebted to a wealthy client like Gable, testified that the cat was in a state of extreme emotional distress and had sustained multiple deep scratches consistent with a canine attack. Thorne didn't ask about the severity, and the vet didn't volunteer it. It was a masterclass in carefully managed testimony. Then it was Sarah's turn. Her cross-examination of the vet was quick and brutal. "Dr. Williams," she began, her voice crisp. "In your notes, which we have here as Exhibit B, you described the injuries as superficial lacerations, is that correct?" The vet shifted nervously. "Well, yes, but the psychological trauma. I'm not asking about psychology, doctor. I'm asking about the physical wounds. Were they life-threatening?" "No, but did they require stitches?" "No. In fact, you treated them with a simple antiseptic wash and prescribed a mild sedative, correct?" "Yes. Thank you, doctor." No further questions. She had pricked a small hole in their story, but the video was still the looming mountain they had to climb. Then Thorne called his final witness for the prosecution, Arthur Pendleton. The moment his name was called, a jolt went through him. It was a tactical move Arthur himself would have used. Call the opposing party as a hostile witness to control his narrative from the outset. As he walked to the stand, he could feel every eye in the room on him. He felt the weight of their judgment, the whispers of his past. Thorne circled him like a shark. "Mr. Pendleton," he began, his voice dripping with false sympathy. "It is true, is it not, that you were once a highly successful corporate lawyer in the city?" "Yes," Arthur said, his voice steady. "And it is also true that you left that practice under something of a cloud? A scandal involving a major pharmaceutical client." "I left that practice by choice," Arthur corrected him, his eyes finding Sarah's for a split second. She gave him a tiny, encouraging nod. "A choice you made after your firm's client was exposed in a massive cover-up. A cover-up you helped facilitate? You ran, didn't you, Mr. Pendleton? You ran away from your responsibilities and chose to live as a recluse." "I chose to leave a world I no longer believed in," Arthur said, his voice gaining strength. "A world where truth is less important than victory." "How noble," Thorne sneered. "Tell me, this dog, Shadow, he's a rescue, isn't he? A stray of unknown origin." "He is," Arthur said. "So you have no knowledge of his history? No idea what kind of trauma or violence he might have experienced or perpetrated before he came to you?" "I know the dog he is now. He is gentle and loyal, Loyal to you, perhaps, Thorn countered. But you live in isolation. How can you possibly know how he would react to strangers or to other animals? Isn't it possible that this gentle dog has a primal aggression that you simply haven't seen? The questions were designed to plant seeds of doubt, to paint Arthur as a naive fool and Shadow as a ticking time bomb. Arthur parried as best he could, but Thorn was an expert at twisting words. Finally, Sarah got to put her own client on the stand. She didn't call Arthur. She called Lily. Very gently, Sarah led the blind girl to the witness stand. The simple act of her navigating the unfamiliar space with only the sound of Sarah's voice as a guide silenced the room. "Lily?" Sarah began, her voice soft. "Can you tell the judge about your dog, Shadow?" Lily's voice was barely a whisper. "He's my best friend," she said. "He's my eyes." She described her daily life with Shadow, how he helped her find her shoes, how he guided her around furniture, how his presence next to her at night made the darkness less scary. It was incredibly powerful, heartbreakingly sincere. But on cross-examination, Thorn was mercilessly condescending. "Lily," he said, affecting a kind tone that was more chilling than any shout. "You love your dog very much, don't you?" "Yes, sir." "And you would be very, very sad if he was taken away?" "Yes, sir," she whispered, her voice trembling. "So you would say anything to protect him, wouldn't you? Even if you weren't sure it was the whole truth?" Sarah shot to her feet. "Objection. Counsel is badgering a child." "Sustained," the judge said, a flicker of annoyance on his face. "Move on, Mr. Thorn," but the damage was done. Thorn had framed her testimony as the biased, emotional pleading of a child, not as credible evidence. As Lily returned to her seat, she was crying openly now, the sterile cruelty of the process finally breaking through her composure. Arthur wrapped his arm around her, his own heart shattering. They were losing. The logic, the evidence, the emotion, it was all being systematically dismantled by Thorn's cold, professional demolition. The judge looked down at his notes, his face grim. "Does the defense have any further witnesses?" he asked. Sarah stood up. "Yes, Your Honor." "The defense calls Shadow." A murmur went through the courtroom. Thorn laughed out loud. "Objection. Your Honor, this is a mockery of the proceedings. You can't put a dog on the witness stand." "I'm not calling him to testify, Your Honor," Sarah said, her voice ringing with a newfound authority. "I am submitting him as demonstrative evidence. The plaintiff has made the dog's temperament and identity the central issue of this case. The only way to truly assess that is to see the animal in person. To deny this would be to deny us the right to present a full defense." The judge hesitated, clearly taken aback. It was an unorthodox request, but Sarah's reasoning was sound. He looked from Sarah's determined face to Thorn's sputtering indignation. "Very well," the judge said, a note of curiosity in his voice. "The request is granted. Bailiff, please escort the animal into the courtroom." The moment the heavy courtroom doors swung open, the atmosphere shifted. Dr. Evans led Shadow in on his leash. The dog was calm, his movements fluid and confident, but his senses were on high alert. His ears swiveled, taking in the acoustics of the large room, his nose twitching, deciphering the complex sense of old wood, paper, and human anxiety. His eyes, however, were fixed on only one thing, Lily. He let out a soft whine and pulled gently on the leash, his entire being focused on reaching the crying girl. Dr. Evans released him. Shadow didn't bound or run. He moved with a purpose that was breathtaking to behold. He walked directly to the defense table, ignoring everyone else in the room. He nudged his head under Lily's hand, and she gasped, her tears stopping instantly as her fingers found his familiar fur. She buried her face in his neck, and the dog stood perfectly still, a solid, comforting presence. This act of immediate, gentle devotion sent a silent, powerful message through the room. This was not the snarling beast from Gable's story. But Sarah wasn't finished. "Mr. Gable," she said, her voice sharp, "you testified that this dog, Shadow, turned on you with bared teeth and unprovoked savagery. You claim to be terrified of him. Is that correct?" Gable, seeing the tide turning, bolstered his resolve. Absolutely, he said loudly. The animal is a menace. Then you won't mind if I ask him to approach you? Sarah asked. Before Thorne could object, Sarah gave a quiet command. Shadow, go say hello. Shadow, ever obedient, lifted his head from Lily, looked at Sarah, and then trotted calmly toward the plaintiff's table. His tail gave a slight, hesitant wag. He was not aggressive, he was inquisitive. As he neared Gable, however, his entire demeanor changed. He stopped. The wagging ceased. A low, guttural growl, completely different from the soft whine he'd given Lily, rumbled in his chest. His body tensed, and the fur on his back bristled slightly. He didn't lunge. He didn't snarl. He took a half-step back, lowering his head, his eyes locked on Gable. It was not the look of an aggressor. It was the look of an animal recognizing a threat. He was showing fear and distrust. Gable, in a moment of panic, flinched violently, knocking his chair back. "You see," he shouted, his voice cracking. "It's a monster." "No, Mr. Gable," Sarah said, her voice cold and clear. "He sees you. He recognizes you. And he is afraid of you. Why would he be afraid of you if he'd never had a negative encounter with you before?" The room was dead silent. The judge was leaning forward, his eyes narrowed, watching the entire interaction with intense focus. Then Sarah delivered the final, devastating blow. She walked to the evidence table and picked up the briefcase belonging to Marcus Thorne, Gable's lawyer. It was identical to the one his junior partner was using. "Your Honor," she said, "there is one more piece to this puzzle. Shadow is a highly intelligent animal, trained to assist a blind person. He is exceptionally good at finding dropped or misplaced items." She looked at the dog. "Shadow," she commanded, her voice firm, "find the stick." "Where is the stick?" This was the biggest gamble of all. During their strategy sessions, Arthur had told Sarah about a particular game he played with Shadow. He would hide a specific pinewood stick, and Shadow would always find it. Dr. Evans, on Sarah's desperate request, had secreted that very stick inside a hidden pocket of her own coat before entering the courtroom. Shadow's nose went to the ground. He sniffed around the defense table, then near the bailiff. He was searching, his brow furrowed in concentration. He moved past Gable's table, ignoring the man completely now, his focus entirely on his task. He circled the courtroom, his search growing more frantic. He was following a scent trail only he could perceive. His path led him not to Gable, not to the lawyers, but to the public gallery, to a man sitting in the back row. He was a shabbily dressed man who had been trying to make himself as inconspicuous as possible. Shadow stopped directly in front of him and began to whine and paw at the man's coat pocket, the same behavior he used when he found the hidden stick. The man froze, his face turning ashen. The judge's voice boomed through the silence. "Bailiff, what is the meaning of this?" "Sir, stand up." The man, trembling, stood. The bailiff approached him cautiously. "Empty your pockets, sir." Slowly, reluctantly, the man reached into his coat and pulled out a small, crudely carved wooden bird. But as he pulled it out, something else came with it, falling to the floor with a soft thud. It was a dog whistle, and a folded piece of paper. The bailiff picked up the paper and handed it to the judge. The judge unfolded it. His eyes scanned the page, and his face, which had been a mask of stern neutrality, contorted in fury. "This," the judge declared, his voice shaking with rage, "is a receipt for payment, $500, paid by Mr. Alastair Gable to one Mr. Frank Miller." He glared at the terrified man. "For what service, Mr. Miller?" Frank Miller crumbled. He paid me to get my dog to do it," he stammered, tears welling in his eyes. "My dog, Roscoe. He's a German shepherd. Looks a lot like that one. Gable. He wanted to get that old man and the girl out of the woods. Said they were bringing the property values down. He gave me the whistle. Told me to get Roscoe to chase his cat. He filmed it. He said no one would get hurt." The confession hung in the air, sucking all the oxygen from the room. Gable was on his feet, his face purple with rage and panic. "Lies. This is a conspiracy. A setup." But his protests were hollow, drowned out by the weight of the truth that had just been so dramatically unearthed. It wasn't just about a cat anymore. It was about malicious prosecution, conspiracy, perjury, and a deep-seated cruelty that had targeted the most vulnerable. The dog hadn't just revealed the truth. He had sniffed out the entire rotten conspiracy, following a scent of deceit that no human could detect. He had led them straight to the source. The courtroom erupted. The gavel slammed down, not with the finality of injustice, but with the thunder of revelation. The aftermath was a whirlwind of catharsis and consequence. As Frank Miller's confession echoed in the stunned silence of the courtroom, Alastair Gable's carefully constructed world imploded. His face, once a mask of smug superiority, had collapsed into a canvas of disbelief and terror. His lawyers, Thorne and his associate, were frozen in place, their expressions a mixture of professional horror and personal panic. They were officers of the court, and they had just been made party to a flagrant criminal deception. The judge, his face a thundercloud of righteous fury, pointed a trembling finger at Gable. "Mr. Gable, you will approach the bench. And you, Mr. Thorne." Now their walk to the judge's bench was a walk of shame, every eye in the room boring into them. The judge's words were not for the public, but the venom in his tone was audible even from a distance. He spoke in a low, seething hiss, his hands gripping the edge of his dais so tightly his knuckles were white. While the judge excoriated the disgraced plaintiff and his counsel, Sarah Davies knelt before Lily, who was still clutching Shadow, her face buried in his soft fur. "It's over, Lily," Sarah said, her voice thick with emotion. "We won. Shadow is safe." "You're all safe." Lily looked up, her sightless eyes wide. She couldn't see the victory, but she could feel it. The oppressive tension in the room had vanished, replaced by a buzzing, chaotic energy. The heavy weight that had been pressing on her small shoulders for weeks finally lifted. She threw her arms around Sarah's neck in a fierce, grateful hug. Arthur stood beside them, his hand resting on Shadow's head, the dog's steady presence a grounding force in the swirling emotions. He looked across the courtroom at Gable, now being escorted from the room by two bailiffs, his face pale and slack. Arthur felt no triumph, no desire for revenge. There was only a profound, quiet sense of relief, like a fever that had finally broken. He had faced the ghost of his past, the very system he had fled, and this time truth had prevailed. His redemption felt not like a grand, cinematic moment, but like this: the feeling of a little girl's hand finding his, and the solid weight of a loyal dog leaning against his leg. The judge formally dismissed the case against Shadow with prejudice, meaning it could never be brought again. He then ordered the district attorney's office, which had a representative present, to immediately open a criminal investigation into Alastair Gable for perjury, conspiracy, and filing a false report. Frank Miller, for his cooperation, would likely face lesser charges. The victory was absolute and unequivocal. The ride home in Arthur's old pickup truck was quiet. It was a silence not of anxiety, but of peace. Lily sat in the middle, her head resting on Arthur's shoulder, one hand perpetually stroking Shadow, who sat proudly in the passenger seat, his head held high as if he understood everything. The gray, oppressive sky had broken, and shafts of late afternoon sun speared through the clouds, dappling the forest road in gold and green. The world seemed brighter, the air cleaner. When they arrived back at the cabin, the sanctuary that had been so grievously threatened now felt more sacred than ever. The scent of pine and damp earth welcomed them home. That evening, there was no grand celebration, only a return to the simple, precious routines that Gable's malice had tried to shatter. Arthur built a fire in the hearth, its crackling warmth a counterpoint to the cool evening air. He made Lily's favorite meal, macaroni and cheese from a box, a comfort food that felt more satisfying than any gourmet meal from his past life. After dinner, they sat on the worn rug before the fire. Arthur read from a new Braille book Sarah had gifted Lily, his voice steady and calm. Lily leaned against him, her eyelids growing heavy, while Shadow dozed with his head in her lap, his paws twitching as he dreamed, perhaps, of chasing sticks and uncovering truths. Looking at them, bathed in the soft, flickering firelight, Arthur felt a profound shift within himself. The wound in his soul, the one left by his past failures, had not vanished, but it had begun to heal. The scar tissue, he realized, was not a mark of shame, but a symbol of survival and transformation. He had been so sure that his penance was a lifetime of solitude, but he had been wrong. His redemption wasn't in being alone. It was in being needed, in protecting this small, fierce family he had stumbled into. He had been a wounded healer who had finally found someone to heal, and in doing so had healed himself. The legal battle had forced him to confront the man he had been and choose the man he wanted to become. Sarah Davies had been right. His past was not just a liability. It was the crucible that had forged his present strength. He had recognized the tactics, anticipated the deceit, because he had once been a master of it. He had used the darkness of his own history to bring this new truth to light. The following weeks saw the legal fallout settle. Alistair Gable, stripped of his power and prestige, was convicted and sentenced to community service and a hefty fine, a punishment whose public humiliation was far worse for him than any jail time. His mansion went up for sale. The community, ashamed of their quick judgment, reached out in small, tentative ways. Pie was left on the cabin porch. The owner of the general store insisted Arthur's groceries were on the house. They were gestures of apology, acknowledgments of the wrong they had done. Arthur accepted them with quiet grace. He and Sarah Davies remained in touch, forming an unlikely friendship. She would sometimes drive out to the cabin on a Sunday, bringing legal papers and a bag of donuts. She had an idea. "There are other cases like this, Arthur," she'd said one afternoon. "People without money or influence being pushed around by the system. Animals caught in the crossfire of human cruelty. They need someone who understands the fight from both sides. They need you." It was a seed of a new purpose, a way to use his formidable skills not for profit, but for justice. A way to continue his penance not through isolation, but through service. A year later, the cabin in the woods was no longer a hermit's refuge, but a bustling, happy home. Arthur, with Sarah's help, had established a small, non-profit legal aid service from his front room, specializing in animal welfare cases and representing the disenfranchised. He was Arthur Pendleton, Esquire, once more, but this time the name was a beacon for the hopeless, not the wealthy. His clients didn't pay in stock options. They paid in homemade jam and heartfelt thank-you notes. Lily was thriving. With the security of her home life firmly established, she had blossomed. She was attending a special school in the nearby town, her quick mind and bright spirit making her a favorite among her teachers and friends. She was learning to play the piano, her fingers dancing over the keys with the same sensitivity they used to read Braille. Her world was still dark, but it was no longer small or frightening. It was filled with music, friendship, and the unwavering love of her unconventional family. And Shadow remained the heart of it all. He was older now, his muzzle dusted with a touch of gray, but his eyes were as bright and intelligent as ever. He was still Lily's guide, Arthur's confidant, and the guardian of their sanctuary. He would lie on the porch, watching the sun set over the pine trees, a symbol of the quiet, unshakable loyalty that had saved them all. One evening, as the three of them sat on that same porch, watching the last rays of sunlight paint the sky in hues of orange and purple, Lily reached out and took Arthur's hand. "Papa Art?" she said, her voice clear and sure. "Yes, sweetie? I'm glad Mr. Gable was mean to us," she said. Arthur looked at her, puzzled. "Why on earth would you say that?" "Because," she explained, her logic simple and profound, "if he hadn't been, we might never have known how strong we are together." Arthur looked at the incredible child beside him, and at the noble dog resting at her feet, and he knew she was right. The battle had been horrific, but the victory had forged them into something unbreakable. They were not just three broken souls who had found each other. They were a family, tested by fire and proven true. Dear friends, we have just witnessed a story about the power of truth and the incredible, intuitive wisdom of animals. We saw how arrogance and deceit can build a powerful illusion, but how that illusion can be shattered by the simple, unwavering loyalty of a dog and the courage of those who refuse to give up hope. It reminds us that sometimes the most profound truths are not spoken in words, but are revealed through actions, through loyalty, and through a love that transcends species. The world is full of Gables, people who use their power to silence the vulnerable. But it is also full of Arthurs, Lilies, Sarahs, and Shadows, who are willing to stand up and fight for what is right, no matter the odds. It begs the question, what is the most profound lesson an animal has ever taught you about truth or loyalty? Share your stories in the comments below, for in sharing our experiences, we strengthen the bonds that make us all part of a larger, more compassionate family.